Dr. David Miller, ex-professor at Bristol University, who was sacked a couple of years ago now for speaking out about anti-Semitism or about actually the Zionist lobby within the university. Hi, David.
Hello.
Could you just give us a little bit of an introduction into? I mean, you've been sending me some fascinating things over the last few days, which we'll be talking about in a minute. But your take on this cost of living crisis, because I'm putting forward conspiracy theories here, saying the whole thing is deliberate. Actually, the government doesn't really care about its voters. That the corporations now become so powerful that they can just price fix, and there's nothing much the government can do about it.
Well, when you say it's deliberate, you have to specify who is making it deliberate. Is it the government? Is it the UK government? Is it the US government? Is it the EU? Is it the corporations? You need to specify.
Corporations. Shell, BP, energy companies.
Be specific, yeah. Right. So, but that's not the only reason why we have a cost of living crisis, right? We have a cost of living crisis, yes, because of the corporations. The corporations are evil, yes. That's obviously true. Have been for a long time.
Inflation rates too.
They're in charge, have been in charge since Thatcher allowed them to be in charge from 79 onwards, and then Blair and Brown, of course, followed the same path. But look, we're in a situation which is also influenced significantly by geopolitics, right? So part of the reason that we have the extremes of the cost of living crisis that we do is because of the conflict in Ukraine. So here are the people in the EU who pushed forward with neoliberalism and privatisation and contracting out, all the things that we've seen in this country, and we led on in this country, and then were transferred all the way through the EU. And these are the people who are the ideologues, who believe in free markets, who understand free markets, and who are able to put in place free markets in order to make sure the PCS members get lesser wages and the bosses get more. But when it came to Ukraine, what happened was that they decided that they were going to sanction Russia. Now, if you understand capitalism, you have to understand that you can only sanction a country that isn't self-sufficient. Now, in terms of some things, Russia wasn't self-sufficient, but in terms of oil, in terms of fertilizers, the wherewithal to produce an industrial society and feed its people, Russia is self-sufficient, along with Belarus and the other countries. And of course, it's since, started massive increase of trading with other oil-producing countries, Iran, the Saudis, and even China. And as a result, the sanctions have been a total disaster for European economies and have exacerbated the cost of living crisis. Now, when you look at this, you think, well, how can these people who are supposed to know about capitalism have failed so systematically to understand capitalism? And the reason, I think, is that because we've failed to understand that capitalism doesn't exist, neoliberalism doesn't exist outside of a geopolitical context. And that geopolitical context is unipolarity and the power of US imperialism. And really what we've seen here with the sanctions is the US punishing European economies. And of course it's the same as they've done with the Nord Stream pipeline. They've blown up the pipeline, which has destroyed the ability of Germany to have an industrial economy. So we're seeing our great ally in the US, which is with us and standing in with the people of Ukraine, actually helping to destroy European economies and destroying the lifestyles and the life standards of the working class across the whole of Europe. So that's for me is the other part of this. It's not just that the corporations are bad people and are trying to screw us every day, which of course they are. It's also the context of geopolitics, which is the Ukraine war.
So is it possible for these corporations and banksters to fight on these two fronts at the same time? Because effectively they're in conflict with their own population. It may take the population a little while to catch up to what's going on, but they're also in population with one of the world's great superpowers now, a nuclear-armed superpower that, as you say, is quite happily self-sufficient, actually. So can they fight both those fronts at the same time?
Well, when you say the people who run the corporations, some of these corporations you mentioned are European-based. BP and Shell, for example, are based in the UK and in the Netherlands. But these are transnational corporations. They don't owe loyalty to this country, to the UK, to France or Germany. They owe loyalty to their transnational club. That's where there is potentially some kind of conflict between transnational capital and US imperial power. But of course, you know, the largest proportion of the capitalists and the corporations are based in the US still. It has the biggest economy. And so you have a sense in which a lot of the corporations are acting in the interest of the US, but not all of them. So they have a conflict of interest, yes, but they that's not something which we're going to see anything of, except, you know, you'd hear about it when you go to the Bilderberg group, Tony, and you hang out and you try and outside. Outside. Yeah. Inside, you hear some of these conflicts, but we don't hear much of it outside.
No. Justin, what do you make of the geopolitics David's been talking about there, saying actually, essentially, seems to be much better organisation amongst these transnational, the idea of the nation state basically is going out the window. To paraphrase you, David, I'm not sure if you quite said that, but that's the direction it seems to be heading.
I mean, certainly we hear about the piles of cash, and I mean, we were kind of touching on it earlier, weren't we, about how wealthy some of these corporations are. I mean, you hear about corporations that have got more money than fairly substantial countries and stuff like that. So, I mean, again, you know, I absolutely don't know as much as David does about the geopolitical stuff. I'm always keen to focus on the effect that it's having on our members. You know, I'm not trying to be parochial or anything like that. I've got a keen interest in what goes on in the world, but ultimately I've got to bring it down to what faces our members, and that is inflation, and that is the cost of living, and that is the increasing cost of interest and housing. You know, I don't care if it's rented or mortgaged. These are the things that we're working about. It's really interesting to hear about some of the causes of it. And I would dearly love our members to understand that, because sometimes they just don't. But that's a real education piece that we need to do. But ultimately, it's about the cost of living.
Well, we have a lot of hot air from me, from sociologists, from economists, etc. But at the end of the day, whether or not you can afford a roof over your head is one of the most important aspects of all of this. And it came up on the BBC 6 o'clock news last night.
There's fresh evidence that many people on low incomes are being priced out of the rental market. The Institute for Fiscal Studies, a think tank, says just 5% of all new rental properties on the website Zoopla in the first quarter of the year were affordable for those needing housing benefit or universal credit to pay their rent. Here's our social affairs correspondent, Michael Buchanan.
For those households entirely reliant on benefits to pay their rent, it seems there's never been a worse time to look for a home. While housing benefit rates have been frozen since 2020, the IFS say private rents have increased by 20% in the same period. It means the number of affordable properties in Britain on Zoopla fell from 23% in 2020 to just 5% earlier this year, with families in Wales struggling the most to find homes that benefits will cover entirely. As the pool of available houses shrinks, low-income families are more likely to be living in properties that are in a state of disrepair and more expensive than average to heat, according to the IFS. Ministers say they're spending £11.5 billion delivering affordable rented homes across the country. But the increasingly acute housing problem was underlined by other data published today, which shows the number of people sleeping rough in London last year increased by 21%.
Well, that's just, so an extra fifth of people sleeping rough in London just in a year. David Miller, this is something that doesn't often really get properly looked at, does it? We're in a situation where those forced onto benefits, living on benefits, or many of the lower paid are simply, they're finding it now impossible to find somewhere to live if they have to move, if a landlord evicts them, needs to use the house, wants to sell the house, etc. There's nowhere for them to go.
Yeah, I mean, it's a vicious attack on the poorest in the society, and I mean, this is what I'm old enough to remember when there were no homeless people on the streets of Edinburgh and Glasgow where I lived, and there were no homeless people on the streets of most of the major cities. In London, there was some, but the Tories systematically increased the number of homeless. They forced people out of mental health institutions with their care in the community policy, which of course essentially meant people who had mental health problems were just abandoned in the society, and still haven't been properly dealt with.
Yeah, Virginia Bottomley. Yeah.
Well, yeah, there are many names of Tory infamy we can list that took part in that policy, and this is increasing. You know, as you say, 20% in the last year. That's just truly extraordinary, staggering society. I mean, when you read back on the awfulness of the 1930s, when you read George Orwell's book, or you know any of those books, or even go back to Engels' stuff about the condition of the working class in England. You know, we are back in that situation. I mean, it's incredible that we had a period between 1945 and 1979 where inequality declined as a result of social democratic governments, including the Tories who bought into those policies to some extent. And since then, we've had a massive widening of the gap between rich and poor. So it's back to, I don't know the figures, but isn't it worse now than the Victorian era? So we have an appalling attack on the poorest in our society, led, of course, by the Tories and their friends in the hedge funds and in the banks. And they will never stop this. They will only increase their punishment of the poor unless we stop them. That's why unions like the PCS, with a new radical agenda, are so important to this agenda to fighting back. But we need to generalise this struggle across the whole of the society in order that we can push back against the bosses. Otherwise, they will just continue to do this.
Yeah, well, they are, and that's called the Strikes Bill, Justin, isn't it? We've got legislation coming through the pipelines which is going to make it even more difficult to go on strike.
Yeah, with the minimum service level guarantee and... yeah, I mean, the government have argued that many other countries across Europe have this. It's nowhere near the sort of draconian measures that they want to bring in this country. It's not going to affect certain aspects of the civil service as much as some other areas, teaching, for example, railways. But, I mean, they'll probably try and impose it on driving examiners, for example, who are our members, and we've got them right across the region, right across the country. Yeah, it's just another one in the continuing line of attacks that have gone on, as David said, since about 82, 83. When they really got this momentum going. And to be honest with you, I think they're scratching around now, looking at it and going, "Oh, what else can we change? What else can we change? Let's have a minimum service level guarantee, etc." I don't know where they go after this, but I would say one thing: no matter what they do, trade unions keep managing to get members out on industrial action. They thought the 50% was going to be the end of us. Well, that's just made us organise even harder. And frankly, I hope you take this in the right way, and I hope the listeners do as well. Throw as many barriers in the way as you like, because we will find a way to overcome them, and it will make us stronger and better organised, and we will fight back.
Amazing that the government's attitude, rather than to find some sort of an argument, as Mick Lynch was saying the other week, is just to stop you doing it, to try and bring in a new law to stop you. Well, we'll see how far we get with that. Anyway, Justin Thomas, regional organiser for the southwest of England, thank you very much for joining us. We'll go over to have a listen now to this is a clip for you, David, particularly, and you, Martin, to Keir Starmer channeling Tony Blair. This is a discussion on Talk Radio earlier this week, last week, sorry, about is Starmer channeling Blair? This is a discussion between Mike Graham and John Rentoul, and Mike Graham then goes into his knowledge of people like Peter Mandelson and Alistair Campbell back in the Blair government, phoning up journalists to threaten them with their jobs if they reported a story in a certain way, which I found quite fascinating too. So this is from last week on Blair being channelled by Starmer.
The problem with the House of Lords is it's got too many Lib Dems in it, isn't it?
There's far too many Lib Dems and crossbenchers and independents and all.
It hasn't got too many Tories in it, has it?
It's got a lot because the Conservatives have been in government.
It's basically got too many people. Period, hasn't it?
Well, yes.
Should they not?
It shouldn't be there.
But would it not make more sense if Keir Starmer actually said, "I'll tell you what we're going to suggest is we're going to suggest a freeze on sending people to the House of Lords."
Yeah, but he can do a freeze after he's packed it with some Labour people first.
Right. So is he going to put Gordon Brown in there?
I
presume if he's talking to Tony Blair's saying, whatever you do, don't give Gordon Brown a peerage. We still don't talk to each other.
I don't think
they still don't talk to each other, do they?
Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, yes, they do. But
it's only under specific circumstances.
It's quite formal.
Yeah.
But none of those new Labour people want peerages. Alistair Campbell, Alan Milburn, Tony Blair.
Well, Alistair Campbell shouldn't get one.
Oh, of course he should.
Why?
Because he's a very talented politician.
No, he's not. He's a ghastly individual who turns on people in a horrible way, who bullies people and has always bullied people, and is, frankly speaking, a man who should have to answer for what he did during the Iraq War.
Yeah, which was to tell the truth at all times. We've had this argument before.
Yeah, no, but it's not an argument.
You're not right.
No, it's not an argument. It's the situation which is the real world in which you don't live because you love Tony Blair so much and you think everybody associated with him should be given some kind of honour.
I think Alistair Campbell is an extremely talented individual.
No, I think he's extremely flawed.
Should have been an MP.
No, he's an extremely flawed individual. If he wants to stand for election, then let him do it. But what he shouldn't do is grandstand, which is what he does do, bully people on television, which you know he used to do when he was in Number 10.
No,
because I know he used to do it because I've heard him doing it.
No.
Because I've heard him ringing people up and I've heard him saying things to them that were quite frankly absolutely unforgivable. As a public civil servant,
I have no.
Well, I can give you absolute chapter and verse on that, and I can name you several people who have been in receipt of those calls.
He stood up to Adam Bolton on television once.
He did once do that.
Most entertaining.
But that was after he was out of Downing Street. When he was in Downing Street, he used to phone up the BBC on a regular basis and berate them for not leading with stories that he'd given them.
You mean he
used
did
to
his job?
No, that's not his job to bully people.
Not
his job to bully people. He rang several people that I personally know on newspapers and threatened to get them sacked if they didn't do what he said, particularly over Lord Mandelson and a particular story in Japan, and I know that for a fact.
Well, I don't.
Well, I'm telling you it's true.
Well,
so you can impugn me and my veracity if you wish, but you'd be wrong to do so. And I think to defend Alistair Campbell doesn't do you any favours, seriously.
Well, I'm sorry, I'm going to defend him.
All right, well, I hope he doesn't end up in the House of Lords, because I might have to start publishing some of the stuff I know about him.
Right, okay, well, he's not going to the House of Lords because he doesn't want to, so...
Well, that's good. Excellent. He can carry on writing for the European and making a nuisance of himself elsewhere. Anyway, so, what...
That's John Rentoul and Mike Graham chit-chatting week before last, David, about the this is actually quite a pernicious concept, isn't it? The idea of senior politicians at the time and their director of communication phoning up journalists and saying, "Look, if you print a word of that, I've got ways of getting you sacked." And in fact, what he's saying there is effectively the same to Alistair Campbell. If you go into the House of Lords, I know a whole load of dirt on you, which I'm going to publish. So this sort of thing seems to be almost like de rigueur now, that journalists can expect phone calls if they print a story, and potentially those networks or publishers that they're working for don't really seem to back them up. They seem to be, quite happy to accept journalists being phoned up and intimidated.
Well, I mean, I think that what's happened over the last 20 or 30 years is that the media establishment has become more and more integrated into the what should we call it? C. Wright Mills's phrase, perhaps, the power elite. So that there's much more of, I mean, he mentioned it in that discussion, didn't he? The notion of a bubble and people living in that Westminster bubble. They're so close, personally, politically, relationships and marriages, people moving between jobs through the revolving door, from the corporations to lobbying to journalism to politics. That I mean, what I think really is surprising about this stuff about Campbell threatening people is that he had any need to do so. I mean, the overwhelming balance of the media, even at the time of Iraq, when there was still some opposition in the mainstream media, was overwhelmingly in favour of the lies that were told by Alistair Campbell, by Tony Blair, by the US administration, the famous moment at the UN Security Council with the photographs of the alleged chemicals being moved. I mean, from Colin Powell. I mean, that was a huge victory for propaganda. But now we're in a period where the kind of opposition that there was at that stage is nowhere to be seen. It's much worse now than over Ukraine, for example, than it was over Iraq. Within days of the two different the dodgy dossier and the other dossier, both of which were full of lies, being released, it was revealed that they were full of lies. But in fact, in one case, by a postgraduate student at a British university. Now, and that was then got into the mainstream media. Now, you can't imagine that the truth about what's happening in Ukraine and the Nazis and the Ukrainian government. If people discover that, in fact, people already know it and knew it before the invasion, the Russian invasion, it simply can't be mentioned in the mainstream. And there's a kind of, Orwell talked about the memory hole, didn't he? And doublespeak. I mean, you simply cannot mention what's happening in Ukraine, or people will jump down on you and say, "Oh, you're pro-Russian," or you're using Putin talking points and all this kind of stuff. So there's a real inability to have any proper debate on matters of public importance now.
But surely the whole point is that we've got these new organisations like BBC Verify they're the ones that do the proper fact-checking. There's an office above the BBC newsroom where these facts get checked.
Well, I mean, all of these fact-checking organisations, and I would include BBC Verify in this, are organisations which are, to a greater or lesser degree, and this is not true for BBC Verify, but with the other ones, to a greater or lesser degree, directly funded by the state and by the intelligence services. These are all organisations which are set up to purvey disinformation and misinformation under the guise of fact-checking. Let me use the example of Ukraine. I've just recently been doing some research on this. There are several organisations in Ukraine which are claimed to be journalistic organisations run by volunteers who just want the truth about what's happening. But actually, in every single case, these are run directly by government. And in fact, in the Ukrainian case, by banderites, by actual Nazis, who are there to whitewash the existence of Nazis in the Ukraine. And these are organisations which are funded directly by the CIA through the National Endowment for Democracy, and indeed directly by the Foreign Office. I mean, it's an extraordinary thing. All these organisations are funded by one participant in the conflict, and that's the Western participant in the conflict.
Now, you contacted me about this UPA OUNB. What's that? It's 5 letters with a slash in the middle.
Well, I mean, this is the Ukrainian Nazis, right? I mean, the ones who were proto-Nazis before the Second World War were involved in pogroms against the Jews. I think it said 50,000 Jews were killed by these people, and then in the Second World War they were involved in assassinating and killing and murdering Jews and indeed others, Slavs, Poles. I mean, given the role of Poland in the current Ukrainian conflict, extraordinary that the history is that the OUNB, which is the Bandera faction of the Organisation of Ukrainian Nationalists, was involved in killing Poles as well as Slavs and Jews in the Second World War. And these are the organisations which are looked to by the people who have essentially the whip hand in Ukraine now as being an inspiration. People who are involved in pogroms against the Jews and who are actual Nazis.
Martin, this whole idea of the Nazis in Ukraine, it seems that we've got, as David's saying there, the Nazis are actually trying to pretend that it's not, they're not there and it's not happening.
Well, that's right. I mean, the Poles, there was at least 100,000 Poles were murdered by the OUN, and of course the right wing in Poland have still got they think in terms of Lviv being Lvov, which was essentially a Polish majority town with a large Jewish population. And the one stage of the crisis, there was a willingness in the West to consider, to look at the Ukrainian nationalists with a somewhat objective eye, pretty similar to the sort of, the Croatian nationalists in Yugoslavia. They got a pretty good press, but there was also an understanding that they were not necessarily squeaky clean, because obviously they ethnically cleansed the Serbs out of the Krajina. I drove through the Krajina, and just after it had happened, very sinister, because it totally emptied the place out. And the Serbs had lived in that part of the world for over 1,000 years. And the West, NATO, supported the Croatians to drive them out. And but there was an understanding that wars are messy, and there are different factions, and they're going to, and the whitewashing of the right wing in the Ukraine is extraordinary, given the history, and you can see why the Russians are becoming increasingly not enraged, but they're just determined that they're not going to give in to this kind of thing, and the Ukrainian right wing don't necessarily speak on behalf of the ordinary people in the Ukraine, but they've been given very powerful roles in the security structure. They control things like the SBU, which is the secret police, and so on. And the Ukraine, Zelensky said today there's going to be no elections in the Ukraine until the war's over. Well, that means never then. Yeah, he's in power for the duration, unless somebody assassinates him from his own side or whatever. The whole situation is very tense and
well, a lot of people talk about Nazis. What David, is their actual ideology? Is it a racial ideology? Is it a nationalist ideology? Is it based on being anti-Bolshevik, as the original Nazis were, or is it just anti-Russian? What's actually driving them?
Well, yes, they're anti-Bolshevik. Yes, they're anti-Russian. I mean, they're actually also anti-Semitic, deeply, and that's what the extraordinary thing about it is, that Ukrainian nationalism and Zionism show very strong parallels. Zionism comes effectively from the Ukraine to a large extent, and Poland to some extent, Hungary, and they had early alliances with the Ukrainian nationalists. And there's a famous cartoon in the Soviet newspaper from 1925 where there's Vladimir Jabotinsky from Odessa in Ukraine at the grave of Simon Petliura, who was involved in the killings, the pogroms against 50,000 Jews in the 1920s. And in the cartoon, Jabotinsky is there crying at the grave of Petliura, with whom he made an alliance. Now, so the extraordinary thing is that there's that history, and that history has a contemporary resonance. There were 40 Jews fighting with the Azov battalion in Mariupol last year. And do people know that? Of course they don't. So on the one hand, they have this kind of anti-Semitic ideology, and if they take power, there is no doubt they would act on that. On the other hand, there are some sections of the Zionists and the Jews in Ukraine who are on that side. Now, of course, there are some Zionists, very few actually. For example, Edward Dolinsky, who is one of the Zionist leaders there, who has been calling out the rise of Nazism in Ukraine for many years, and of course he's been threatened by the Nazis as a result of that. But that's an extraordinary account, really, of what's been happening there. Is that there are some Zionists who are actually on board with the Azov battalion, and that's really, I think, very disturbing. But in terms of the Banderites, the people who follow Bandera, who led the OUNB, I mean, these are people who are running, as I said, the propaganda operation. So there's an organisation called Inform Napalm. There's an organisation called Mirot Ferets, which is the kill list, which has been run there, both of which are Ukrainian Ministry of Defence projects and are run by people who are active ideological Banderites, and these are organisations who are it's not just Nazi organisations doing disinformation work. They're actually directly supported, as I said, by the CIA through the NAD and by the Foreign Office, but also by British officials. So, I mean, the thing I did the other day, I showed that there's a guy called Cormac Smith, who used to be work for MI6 in this country, and he went over there in 2016-18, and he's still, to this day, doing soft peddling on Nazism, and him and many other British officials are quite happy to use the Nazi greeting, the Slava Ukraini, Heroyam Slava, which of course, back in the day was accompanied by a Nazi salute. And this is infiltrating the British and the American political elite, such that they're engaged, effectively in Nazi apologism.
Well, when I first met you, David, you were doing a lot of work on Islamic extremism, Islamist terrorism. Now we're also talking about this idea of the Zionist Jewish angle on this. Do you think that is there an attempt here to somehow weaponize religion, to take religion, to maybe to create versions of those religions which will then work against that faith? I mean, this is something I find very curious and fascinating, this link between these Zionist terrorists working with Ukrainian Nazis and these groups like Al-Qaeda, Al-Nusra, all these groups that have been concocted by the CIA beginning in, well, a long time ago by the British maybe, but in Afghanistan and then used throughout the last 30 years.
So what we see in Ukraine is that the British are supporting the Nazis effectively in Ukraine. And we shouldn't be surprised at that because, of course, they have previously supported groups which they otherwise would appear to be opposed to. So, like, for example, the Al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria, and called Nusra, now called HTS. So the British were on the same side as those organisations in Syria when they supported what they called the moderate armed opposition. And actually, the person who was in charge of all of those operations to present the moderate armed opposition as being moderate and not as being allied with ISIS or with Nusra was a woman called Alicia Cairns, who is now the chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee. She's an MP now, right? So she was working as overseeing a whole load of MI6 contractors involved in Syria, and she's now, of course, quite happy to do the Slava Ukraini on her social media. So that's the standard way in which MI6 operates, right? It will operate with whoever there is there who can take on the enemy, whatever that enemy is, whether it's Colonel Gaddafi, whether it's Bashar al-Assad, or whether it's Vladimir Putin. But of course, when it comes to home, then of course these people who are our allies in Syria are very bad people, and we must be opposed to them in all respects. And so that we have to engage in a policy which targets those people, and of course they target those people in a way which is not very selective, and which of course effectively targets all Muslims in the country. So since 9/11, we've seen a ratcheting up of the way in which Muslims in this country in particular are targeted by the state. And that means the creation of a whole series of, the retention by the intelligence agencies of a whole series of contractors to present Islam in a certain way and to try and undermine core tenets of Islam, to reshape, and they say this in their internal documents, reshape British Islam so that it is not, so that they would say, so that Muslims don't support terrorism. But what they're actually doing here is trying to make sure that Muslims don't oppose British foreign policy, which of course is the major thing which is a threat to them. There's no real threat of any significant numbers of Muslims in this country supporting Al Qaeda or those organisations. There is a threat of significant numbers of Muslims, and there was a threat over Iraq supporting the anti-war movement and left-wing causes, and there was a huge outpouring of dissent over Iraq, and that's part of the reason they've gone into this heavy propaganda to try and split and take over elements of the Muslim community through a whole range of different organisations.
Well, it doesn't seem to have happened here, but over in France, we're seeing pictures of film of riots taking place in many of the suburbs in Paris now. It does seem to be spreading and getting worse after this specific individual was shot and killed by a policeman for apparently nothing. That's the sort of thing I would imagine that was... Well, I mean, I know it's talked about by Kees van der Pijl in his book, which is looking at all this, is it states of emergency, I think. I was reading a bit of it the other day. What he's saying is that the elites know that as they take power, as the democracy is slowly squeezed out of the system, as the media is slowly strangularised, and that it becomes a kind of propaganda service, that what's going to happen is people are going to rise up. And this is happening at the moment in France. People have just had enough. They're saying what's happened is that you've got a structural system here where the poor are taxed more than the rich are. And you're actually trying to divide society. That's what they're saying to Macron. Now, it's just the first problem he's had. He's had the yellow vest. He's had the pension protests. What do you make of these riots that have been taking place in Paris?
Well, I mean, on the question of Islam, I mean, the French have a particular conception of the role of Islam. It's a much more militant secularism than we have here, because, of course, they got rid of their royal family some time ago through the famous process. So the Islamophobia of the French state is in some ways worse than the Islamophobia of the UK state. But of course, in the UK, it has been very significant that there's an organisation which is part of the British intelligence apparatus inside the Home Office called RICU, the Research, Information and Communications Unit, and it's spent most of the last 15 years, I think it is now, it's been in existence, trying to create fake Muslim groups who are in favour of British foreign policy, who are engaged in saying that the Muslims should wear the poppy, or that extremism is really bad, and we shouldn't be opposed to British foreign policy. And many of these groups, of course, collaborate with Zionist groups, and indeed many of those are themselves funded by the British government to do this kind of counter-extremism work, by which they mean domesticating the Muslim community, making sure that they don't oppose British foreign policy, and of course part of that is making sure that they don't properly oppose the racist ideology of Zionism as well.
What about this Quran burning we've seen in Stockholm? So, I mean, what do you make of that? Because is it my right to go out into the street here if I wish to, and in fact even invite the press to a press conference where I burn a Bible or burn a Quran?
You mean technically is it legal?
Well, I think it is, but why should someone be told this is not a good idea, and should the authorities act in that sort of situation? At the moment, in a weird way, it seems quite a good thing that this is happening in Sweden, because it's stopping their accession to NATO, because the Turks are simply saying, well, if you're going to allow this sort of thing to take place, then you can't be part of NATO. So what's your take on that?
Well, I mean, this is part of an upsurge of Islamophobia we've seen across the whole of Europe and indeed North America as well in the last 15 years. And there are a whole network of organisations and groups from the far right. We've seen in this country, of course, the famous Tommy Robinson character and the various other factions associated with the English Defence League and the organisations which came out of that. And that's part of the same process. These people are all internationally networked. They call themselves the Counter-Jihad movement. And they want to stage provocations against Muslims in order that they can cause trouble. And they can say, look, the Muslims are uncivilised, they don't have our ways, we should get rid of them, etc. So it's a provocation, and we shouldn't fall for that.
No. Martin, what do you make of it? And it's probably going to mean that the NATO conference coming up later this month in Riga is going to... Well, they very much wanted Ukraine to be joining NATO. They very much wanted Sweden to be joining NATO. That looks like it won't happen because of something as simple as the burning of a... Well, it may not be that simple to many people, the burning of a Koran.
It's not going to be in Riga, it's going to be in Vilnius, but yes.
Sorry, yeah.
Well, I mean, the thing is, somebody burning a Koran is actually quite straightforward to do, isn't it? How many people do you need to do it? And, of course, it can cause all kinds of problems and and it's provocational. And I don't know who's behind it, but you can see it's quite straightforward. You know, you could go out and do it. We could go out and do it now this minute. It wouldn't take much organisation to do it. You could film it, put it up on YouTube, and there it is. The Swedish government, no doubt, say, well, look, we can't stop them doing it, but we don't necessarily approve. But, of course, that's not going to satisfy the Turks, because if you tried to do it in Turkey, your feet wouldn't touch the floor. And, of course, in countries like Pakistan, people are constantly struggling with the idea of blasphemy and so on and so forth. Incidentally, we had Farouk Sadiq on here some weeks ago, did we not, who's Bristol Pakistan Association. Most Bristol Pakistanis are totally uninterested in being extremists, and they're very, very knowledgeable about terrorism in a way that the ordinary population are not. They understand it quite thoroughly. So I think that is a headache for the government. But they're obviously, as you say, they're trying to domesticate them with these kind of, AstroTurf organisations which are supposedly speaking on behalf of the moderate Muslims. The moderate Muslims were all opposed to invading Iraq. I mean, the success of the cooperation between Stop the War Coalition and the Muslim Council of Great Britain was excellent, and those relationships continue.
David, what about this? Because we've had some, I think it was the Grey Zone last week, or maybe even the week before, because we had to miss the show last week, publishing more details about the British role in Gladio. We don't hear a lot about that. The Operation Gladio, which was where the NATO intelligence services were colluding with the far right, mainly in Italy, to create terrorist attacks that were then blamed. Largely, they were blamed on Russian people of Russian influence or the Soviet influence at the time in the 1980s. Is it significant to hear that the Brits were more involved in this Gladio network?
Yes, I mean, it is, especially in the current context where, I mean, we start off with the Ukraine question, and as you were saying, in the period in 2014 after the NATO-backed coup in Ukraine, up until the 2022 invasion by the Russians, it was quite possible in the mainstream media to understand and see stuff about there being Nazis in Ukraine. But what I think we now see as they've consolidated their grip inside Ukraine is that we now begin to realise and now begin to remember, if you like, that the Nazis never really went away, which is as the famous song has it, that actually the creation of the West German Intelligence Agency was done by the CIA by employing a guy who had been one of Hitler's high officials. Many of the people who ran NATO later in the period between 1945 and now had been Nazi officials, and there was a concerted effort by the CIA to, rather than to denazify, as was supposed to be the process, to actually protect Nazi officers so that they could use them in intelligence operations. Now, of course, the British were involved in that, and what's striking, I think, is the way in which that has its resonance now. I mentioned that the thing you mentioned the other just a minute ago about the Bolshevik bloc of nations. I sent that thing to you the other day, which indicates that there were Ukrainian Nazi youth group meetings of hundreds of people in the UK in the 1960s. Now, I had no idea that was the case. And this was after, of course, the Nazis in Ukraine were defeated by the Soviets. It took them until 1959 to defeat the Banderites in Ukraine. But in the 60s, there were organisations of Ukrainian nationalists organising youth camps in the UK. For example.
Who was funding this anti-Bolshevik nation magazine? I mean, it was quite, reasonably well produced. Who's funding it? Do we know?
I don't know. I mean,
it looks a bit like the Encounter or something like that.
It's a little bit like a kind of a Nazi Encounter, yeah. and so what I think is striking about this is that I think even me, right? I think I believed that was something of the past, and I'm beginning to see that actually some of that elements of Nazism never really went away, because of course it was used by Western intelligence services, and indeed there are elements of it which survived. They survived in Ukraine, and of course they have elements of survival elsewhere, especially through the intelligence services. And that I think is a revelation to me, anyhow. Maybe I was just naive.
No, I don't think so. I think most of us were sold 20, 30 years through our press that was the end of Nazism. It had been, done away with, Martin, weren't we?
We were, and there's certain levels of cognitive dissonance. We were talking earlier about, Al Qaeda regarded as an enemy organisation in the propaganda within the Western nations like Britain, but in actual fact, they were set up by the Western intelligence services. They themselves admit it. The story is that they set up Al Qaeda as a sort of international brigade to fight in Afghanistan, and then they went rogue, which is just rubbish. Obviously, they still control it now, and I'm quite sure the Russian general staff, the Iranian general staff, Chinese general staff, they know this. The scales have fallen from their eyes. It doesn't surprise me at all that the British were involved in Gladio. They are a senior member of the NATO partnership. And of course, they were keen to setting up Al Qaeda because of the historic links of Britain to the Muslims in the British Empire. So they were given the lead role on that. The Ukrainian nationalists fled from the Soviet Union at the end of the war, and they were all welcomed with open arms into the West. Loads of them settled in Canada. Krista Friedland, who's the current foreign minister, I think, her grandfather was one of them. And they were immediately weaponised as a means to try and roll back communism in Eastern Europe. So there was actually an armed struggle went on in the Ukraine until the 50s, and then it was crushed. And all of this stuff has been there as an undercurrent all along, but it's now coming to a head. And the kind of Nazism, fascism we're facing now is also, on the other hand, in favour of gay rights and trans rights and so on. And all of this is turning everything. Everything is topsy turvy. It's a kind of looking glass world where nothing is as it seems, and. This is coordinating all of this is the intelligence services behind all of this.
I'm glad you brought up LBGT, trans rights, etc. Because I'd love to get Dave's take on this as well. Over the last couple of weeks, I found fascinating little bit of secret recording done by some school kids, 13-year-old school children at Rye College with one of their teachers, who they took issue with. So let's have a listen to that now. It's about 3 minutes long, and here a teacher is trying to admonish some of her pupils for their apparently bigoted racist attitudes, or bigoted anyway, and homophobic attitudes. And they are really quite vociferous in speaking back against her.
How dare you? You just really upset someone. Saying things like, should be in an asylum.
I didn't say that. I just said if they want to identify as a cat or something, then they're like genuinely unwell. Then they've gone, they're crazy.
You were questioning their identity.
No, I wasn't a question. I was just saying about the genders. I didn't say anything about them.
But where did you get this idea from? There's only two genders.
I just said my opinion. That is my opinion. If I respect their opinion, can't they respect my opinion?
It is not an opinion.
Yes, it is.
It's not an opinion.
There's only two genders. Those people think there's only two genders. There's only a boy and a girl. Literally. There's no other private part. There's only two.
Gender is not linked to do with not linked to the parts that you were born with. Gender is about how you identify, which is what I said right from the very beginning of the lesson.
I just don't agree with that. So why should I have to listen to
biological sex, there is actually 3 biological sexes, because you can be born intersex. You can be born with male and female body parts or hormones.
Yeah.
Did you know that?
Yeah, there's 3. There's not 300. Doesn't mean...
Yeah, there's 3. I'm talking about biological sex. In terms of gender, there are lots of genders. There is transgender. There is agender, people that don't believe they have a gender at all.
Yeah, but you can't have that. You
can't have that. It's not a law.
Yeah, but it's not a law, but it's our opinion. We just don't agree with it. We just think it's all just... If you have a vagina, you're a girl. If you have a penis, you're a boy.
Yeah. But cisgender is not necessarily the way to be. You were talking about the fact that cisgender is the norm, that you identify with the gender of the sexual order that you're born with, or you're weird. That's basically what you're saying, which is really despicable.
How? When it's... If I called my mum right now, my mum would feel my side. If I called my mum, she'd say...
Well, that's very sad as well, then.
How is it? Loads of people agree with that. There's only a small majority of people who actually think that.
And why do you think we have so many problems in the world with homophobia?
Yeah, but
because of people
that's gender. Yeah, I'm fine with lesbians and gay people.
Same.
I've got nothing against them.
Yeah, same. But gender is... There is a link between it, and you're saying that people can't change
No, they can't.
To be.
They can't. Unless you get a penis attached. No, I'm not.
You're confusing sex and gender.
No, I'm not, though, because if you have a vagina, you're a girl. If you have a penis, you're a boy. Yeah, you can't have a vagina and be a girl. But then even then, because you've got those genes.
How you identity. How you identify. It's not an opinion that we're expressing this school.
Yes, it is.
No, it's not. And if you don't like it, you need to go to a different school. So I'm reporting you to Miss Willis. You need to have a proper educational conversation about equality, diversity and inclusion, because I'm not having that expressed in my lesson. When I'm teaching you about you can be who you want to be, how you identify is up to you.
They just don't say it, because then all this happens.
Maybe because they're polite and maybe they're sensitive.
I haven't said anything in all of the lessons I've been in. It's just because they turned around and started saying something. So I said, how can you identify as a cat when you're a girl?
Well, they're now writing a statement. I would imagine that you'll be asked to write a statement as well.
We will. Yeah, we will.
Yeah, so there's the 13-year-olds fighting back against their teacher. Martin, their attitude is, look, I mean, actually, we've been sitting listening to this for weeks and months, and we're fed up with it. Actually, we don't believe any of it.
Well, I'm just quite poor quality things. I'm trying to follow it and trying to listen to it. I think I've read about this as well. I mean...
yeah, it's from Rye College. I think it's East Sussex, somewhere down on the south coast.
Well, at the moment, I believe the government is saying, because the teaching unions and the teachers are asking them, give us some clear guidelines on how we should approach this issue. And the government has said that before the end of term, which is 2 weeks away, they're going to provide guidelines for schools about how to deal with this.
Well, that teacher has already got her guidelines. Well, she's saying, you have broken the rules, I'm going to report you and you may have to leave this school.
Yeah. Yes, I heard what was going on there. Well, I mean, there's clearly a huge row, debate, whatever you want to call it, about these issues going on. My own views on it are probably not the same as that of that teacher, but you can see that this is definitely being pushed. There's a definite agenda of people pushing this, but it's not clear what the government's guidelines for teachers are going to be.
There's one basic thing the teacher says.
Because there's no guidelines, teachers are trying to avoid having these conversations.
One basic thing the teacher said there about them being homophobic, they're saying, well, I've got nothing against lesbians and gays. I just think it's ridiculous for people just to be able to identify as various different sexes, some of which don't exist.
Well, I think this is the issue, isn't it? Can you just completely erase the idea of biological sex and put it under the term gender? I think that a lot of what we think of as male or female characteristics is cultural. You know, the Romans wouldn't wear trousers because they thought they were effeminate, but there you go, that was the Romans. But of course, I think underlying all of this stuff is an attempt to bog us all down in discussing irrelevancies. We're about to have a potential nuclear war.
Martin, it's not irrelevant for those kids, is it? Because they are now potentially facing being expelled from the school.
Yeah, but I mean, the schools do expel kids for all sorts of things all the time. I mean, we do get kids who are, in fact, homophobic, racist, and so on. We deal with it all the time.
I mean, that teacher will probably
saying those kids are.
That teacher would probably be convinced that it's hate speech and that these kids.
Well, I mean, I think that when she used the word despicable, I don't think that was helpful. She's not engaging them, is it? She wants to engage, I mean, and they don't necessarily have to agree with her either, do they? Surely we can have a debate about this.
Anyway,
we can
David, a sociologist, let's bring you in, David, on this. What do you make of this whole LBGT plus movement?
Well, I mean, the way in which it has been co-opted, the LGBT movement, the lesbian and gay movement, let's put it like that, it's been co-opted by power, is, I think, the most extraordinary element of it. I mean, I saw something just the other day in Munich, the Pride demonstration there was a performance of a Band Right song at Pride. Now, that's kind of a bit jarring, but, you know, GCHQ, the British Signals Intelligence Agency, of course, has lit itself up in the Pride flag, and what's been happening is that not just the kind of the commercialisation of Pride and of the lesbian and gay movement, but also of its use by imperialism in penetrating non-Western countries. And I use the word penetrating advisedly, you know, whether there's an attempt to try and foment revolutions in countries which are not seen as being friendly to the West. And of course that's at the forefront of that is our liberal values of one sort or another. They use feminism to some extent, they use the lesbian and gay movement, and of course they use all sorts of other issues like hate speech and freedom of speech as means to pursue what are called colour revolutions. They did it in Eastern Europe, they did it in Ukraine in 2004, and of course they've tried to do it in a whole number of other countries. And that's, of course, what the British intelligence and the US intelligence agencies are up to. That's what the National Endowment for Democracy is for. That's why they fund all sorts of journalistic activities to try and subvert and undermine state power in states which are not friendly to the West. Now, that seems to me to be a problematic issue, and it's something which we in this country have to start to understand. And I think I would say the final thing I would say about it is that you know, people in the West ought to understand that liberal ideas are not necessarily the only ideas in the world and not necessarily the best ideas in the world, and that people in other countries have other ways of understanding the world which are not necessarily inferior to Western liberalism. Western liberalism is a particular sort of politics and a particular sort of ideology. People in the left have always rejected Western liberalism, but you know, we don't have in the end to say all of the countries outside the West have views on gender or on sexuality or on religion which are inferior to those in the West, because Western ideology is itself linked to power and linked to interest, and so we shouldn't be scared, I think, of being critical of liberalism.
Well, earlier this week, 12 people were killed in a Kramatorsk restaurant by a missile attack by the Russians. Certainly it was being pitched here in the West as just innocent people having a spot to eat in a restaurant in Kramatorsk. And the Russian side, if you have a look at that, what they're saying is that they believe that there were a whole bunch of NATO officers in there, Martin, having a chat with people from the Ukrainian army and having a bit of a meal with them. What do you make of this attack, David? Maybe you first. What do you make of this sort of, what we've got here is, it's being pitched into the Western public as an atrocity.
So it would appear that civilians did die in the attack, but it's also pretty clear that there were military in there. And whether that makes it a legitimate target or not, it probably doesn't. But it does seem clear that there were people with all sorts of military attire and logos, which has been clear from the videos which have come out, and audio from the scene with them trying to dig out people in military uniforms. So, again, we see the latest in a long line of stories from Ukraine, which doesn't live up to its initial billing in the West. And it turns out when you look at the full facts that there's something else going on.
What do you make of Kramatorsk, Martin?
Well, I think it's interesting that Zelensky is saying that they've got a traitor who fingered the restaurant. Now, if it's a random attack on a civilian restaurant, you don't need somebody to finger it to be attacked. I think what it is, it's actually, the restaurant is not on the street, it's in a hotel. So basically what you've got is the hotel is full of Western mercenaries.
Can we just have a listen to yesterday's BBC News report on the attack? This is the BBC, by the way.
The Ukrainian president says a man accused of helping Russia with this week's deadly attack on the city of Kramatorsk will be charged with treason. Volodymyr Zelensky said those working with Russia to destroy lives deserve the maximum penalty. 12 people were killed in the missile strike on a busy restaurant. 4 people from the UK were among more than 60 others who were wounded. From Kiev, our security correspondent Gordon Carrera reports.
The Ukrainian security service says that on Tuesday the suspect had been instructed to find out whether the restaurant was open and who was there. They claim the man, an unnamed local who'd been recruited by Russian military intelligence before last year's invasion, then covertly filmed the pizzeria and the cars parked nearby before sending the footage to his handlers. Russia claims it does not target civilians, but the missile struck the restaurant at 7:30 that night. The victims included 3 teenagers and also one 32-year-old American man. 12 foreign citizens, including 4 from the UK, were among those injured. President Zelensky said the alleged spotter for the Russians would be charged with treason and could face life imprisonment. On the same day as the missile strike in Kramatorsk, another man was sentenced to 10 years in prison for passing on details of the position of Ukrainian troops, artillery and logistics routes to Moscow.
So that's the BBC News report on it. It certainly doesn't sound like some sort of random attack, especially if they're military. We hear there 4 people from the UK were caught in the attack. Well, they are potentially British military officers.
Well, or lower ranks possibly. I don't know. This is a deliberate attack on the restaurant, it seems to me, and it's a deliberate attack on what they saw as, if you remember at the beginning of the crisis, a load of mercenaries were bust into Lviv, and they got them all settled down in a hotel. They'd only just arrived in the Ukraine, and the Russians waited till they were all settled in, and then hit their hotel with a missile and killed them all. Because they're not going to wait for them to turn up on the front line to be playing Call of Duty. If you turn up to the Ukraine to fight, we're going to kill you. And the Russians have made that absolutely clear. British mercenaries are very heavily involved in the Ukraine. The British Special Forces are definitely involved. They've admitted that several, scores of SAS are out there. And there's only 400 of them in total. And a lot of the attacks on the Kerch Bridge, which killed 3 civilians, remember? Yeah, 3 civilians were killed in the attack on the Kerch Bridge. That was the British. The assassination of Zarkachenko, the Prime Minister of Donbass Republic in 2017, bombing his office. That's got the fingerprints of British Special Forces all over it, to my mind. And they are advising the Ukrainians, even if they're not directly involved.
So it's the idea, David, do you think, that simply the more the NATO people from the NATO countries in Ukraine that we kill, the less likely they are to enthusiastically join the fight?
From the Russians' point of view,
yeah.
You mean? Well, I think that the Russians are steadily taking the gloves off as NATO escalates. Then the Russians are saying, well, if you're going to start trying to bomb the Kremlin, if you're going to send people into Belgrade, then we're going to take direct action against the equipment coming in and indeed the people coming in. It's perfectly clear that there are Western mercenaries there. I mean, actually, it's perfectly clear that very senior British intelligence and military figures are directly advising and have been directly advising the Ukrainians since 2014. So, it's not really a surprise that this would happen. When you look at the footage of the restaurant, I mean, when there was a mention of the cars outside, well, the cars outside are military vehicles, and you can see that from the footage. These are not vehicles that have rocked up after the explosion. These were vehicles which were covered in dirt and grime from the explosion. So, from the Russian point of view, yes, it was a military target, but of course, it appears that civilians have been killed in it.
Can I just say this thing about civilians? If you go to a restaurant full of military personnel, then you might end up dead. And of course, this is the sort of thing the IRA used to do as well. If you don't hang around close to military people, don't talk to them, don't have anything to do with them. because we're going to kill them, and if you're in the way as well, you're going to be killed as well. And the British have killed millions of people in Iraq and Afghanistan and Libya in the last 20 years alone.
This is collateral damage of various sorts.
That's right.
Yeah.
When we were dropping bombs all over Iraq, plenty of babies were burned.
If you think about the drones hitting wedding parties, funerals, this sort of thing.
That's right.
Pretty horrific toll on the civilian population. Anyway, finally, David, we've got to talk about, finally we'll be talking a little bit about your fighting fund, but what about this coup on Saturday, the 24-hour coup, supposed coup anyway? I was quite amused to hear the frantic sounds of the British press all the way through Saturday, talking about how Putin was about to be toppled, overthrown, this was the worst day for him ever, the whole of the Russian state was starting to crumble as Wagner turned in on them, but anyway, at the end of the day, apparently it's all settled. Doesn't sound like the ordinary kind of coup to me.
Well, I mean, Prigozhin had a little chat with Lukashenko. He said, "Mate, you want to come to Minsk and hang out here for a while?" And Prigozhin says, "Yeah, that'll be fine. We don't want to cause any mayhem or any murder." So, I mean, I think the key questions really are: was this a real thing? Or was it a Russian psyop? Now, at the beginning, I was leaning much more towards the Russian psyop. That both Putin and Prigozhin were just acting. I mean, it looks like that's what Prigozhin has been doing.
That means telling the Western press what they wanted to hear.
Yeah. So it looks like that's what Prigozhin was doing before. Because if you remember when Artemovsk, or Bakhmut, as it's called in Ukraine, was about to fall, and Prigozhin was saying, "These in the Russian Ministry of Defence, they're not giving us any artillery or weapons. We can't fight. We're losing tons of men. This is terrible." That appears, in retrospect, to have been a psyop, that they were, just playing. But, this now possibly looks like Prigozhin is a little bit of a feisty character, and perhaps he was doing something serious. But in either case, there was no threat to Putin, and there is no threat to Putin inside Russia. He is overwhelmingly popular, 80% approval ratings.
What about these Wagner troops and the tanks on the streets in Russian cities? I mean, that's not just pretend?
Nothing happened. Well, it wasn't pretend. The tanks were there, but nothing happened. What was the most interesting thing that happened, which appears to be the most violence that happened during the whole period, was that there were civilians on the streets in Rostov who were fighting each other about whether they supported the Wagner or they supported the Russian Ministry of Defence. So, I mean, that seems to have been the highlight of the event.
What you're saying is that it could be that a lot of these troops just went into the cities for a bit of rest and recuperation, and the whole thing was then spun into something completely different.
Well, it's said, I mean, who knows, but it's said that many of them were kind of suckered into it, didn't really realise what they were doing, and then some of them weren't very happy about it. I don't know.
Martin?
Well, obviously, I've been reading lots and lots of different interpretations of this. I think the real question to ask is, was Prigozhin in any way working with the SBU or with the West? Because there's some evidence that he had some contact with the Ukrainian intelligence service when he went the last time to Africa. I've never been a big fan of Prigozhin. I mean, you just think, well, what the hell's he doing?
I mean, the obvious thing is, it's a mercenary army. The obvious thing on Saturday morning is maybe somebody has offered him more money. This is a mercenary army
They're not really a mercenary army. They get their weapons and they get their bullets from the Russian Ministry of Defence. So that's another reason to think that there's nothing real about some of it.
Well, I mean, some people think that this was all a Russian psyop. I tend not to think so, because it hasn't done them much good. It hasn't done them much harm either, because in actual fact it's just shown how weak anybody who wanted to stand up to the government of Russia, and let's not personalise it as Putin, because the target of Prigozhin's expletive laced rants was Shoigu and Gerasimov.
Yeah.
And he kept Putin out of it. The other thing about it is that the fundamental thing that's been going on is there's more than one private military company in Russia. Wagner's the biggest one, but there's lots of other ones, and they're all being reorganised to be put under the direct control of the Ministry of Defence. Now that means an end to Prigozhin's gravy train. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's exactly why he's basically a gangster oligarch of the old school. He's a product of the Yeltsin era.
Could you compare him to Eric Prince?
Well, no, Eric Prince has got some military background. Prigozhin hasn't. He's just a gangster.
He's a chef, right?
Well, he says he's a chef, but I mean, in actual fact,
but he also didn't he also run the Internet Research Agency, which was
but they say what he's done is he's I mean, I would never have trusted him as far as I could spit, frankly. And this is the problem. I mean, Moon of Alabama, Bernhardt is a German guy who runs that. He just made a big quote from Machiavelli about the problem with mercenaries. The problem with mercenaries is they fight for money. And if somebody offers them more money, they change sides. Now, I don't think that's straight. They're not mercenary in that sense, as you say. Yeah. Just like the private military companies that are spun off the British Army don't go out shooting British soldiers. Because it's a way of having stuff you can do where, for example, loads of Wagner people were killed in Syria, and if there'd been Russian regular forces, the mums would have been saying, this is outrageous, why are our boys dying in Syria? But if it's a load of ex-cons working for Wagner, there's not so much of a fuss, which is exactly why they use private military companies in Afghanistan, the West.
I mean, it's certainly the case that the Russians didn't regard it as a serious threat which they should engage. I mean, if you saw the footage of the operation to block the main highways into Moscow, they put lorries across them, they took the keys, or they dug little holes. Yeah. And then, of course, Wagner comes along and just pushes the lorries away. And, of course, there's no military there to shoot at them or stop them or anything.
Well, I think the policy has been to try and get it sorted as quickly as possible with the minimum amount of bloodshed, which is admirable. But of course, one of the problems is, what I understand, is that they didn't realise that Wagner had Pantsir missiles on the convoy that was going from Rostov to Moscow, and various Russian helicopters flew over, buzzed them, and they shot them down, which killed several pilots. Now, if the Russian Air Force are going to be pretty fed up with that, and they're going to demand that the people who shot our people, killed our people, will have to face punishment.
David, what's your take on where things are heading with this Ukraine war?
Well, I mean, we have seen the much vaunted attempt by the Ukrainians to fight back. They were going to launch this in the spring, and they've eventually now launched it. They seem to have taken some territory, have been allowed by the Russians, I think, into fire traps, and then they've been pushed back within hours in almost every case, I think. So it's a massively unsuccessful counterattack, and the result of it has been that a huge number of newly delivered Western military equipment has just ended up as scrap, including the much vaunted German Leopard tanks, the American fighting vehicles, Bradley fighting vehicles, etc. So it's been a way for the Russians to destroy, what is it, the third or the fourth army now that's been thrown against them since the beginning of the special military operation. And as a result, we see the Russians are in full control, really, and the question really is, what is their game plan? I mean, they currently control almost all of 4 oblasts or districts in Ukraine, the two Donbass districts and 2 others. What are they going to stop there, or are they going to take another 4 and up to Kiev, or even more than that? That's the question, I think, which is outstanding.
Well, that question might be answered with the United States is close on approving the ATA-CMS for Ukraine, which is another missile system. They seem to be sitting there watching and wondering, well, if the missiles become longer range, well, we have to just keep going. And this seems to be maybe the NATO game plan, is every time the Russians move forward and start to slow down, then they introduce a new missile system for the Ukrainians.
Yeah, I mean, it's a step-by-step escalation, isn't it? A year ago, Biden was saying that under no circumstances would they get tanks or particular missiles or helicopters or F-16s, but now this is now cleared to be supplied.
Well, the Army tactical missile systems, just looking them up here, have a range of up to 190 miles. That's potentially going to force the Russians to advance further, Martin.
Well, that's what, Lavrov said, the more you introduce these things in, the more we'll have to push you back just to make sure you can't, because they were shelling indiscriminately into the Donbass for years. Yeah. So we're talking about this Kramatorsk restaurant thing. That's a precision hit compared to what they would do.
I mean, there's a lot of talk recently over Russian nuclear weapons starting to be deployed out in Belarus. We've had from the Grey Zone, Max Blumenthal yesterday, a report of him speaking actually down at the UN Security Council. I don't often see him down there. He's a bit like Roger Waters going down and speaking there. What about Max telling the UN Security Council, why are we tempting nuclear annihilation? Because it does seem to be a kind of fear factor here. It's extremely risky strategy for the West to, even if it is a lose scenario, they've got no intention of actually winning. We're getting far closer towards the potential of a nuclear exchange of some kind than we've had even during the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Yeah, I mean, it's extremely worrying. I mean, the problem with the people who run NATO is that they have no analysis of the Russians. They don't have any proper understanding of the Russians. I mean, people who are in charge of this kind of stuff, people like Chris Donnelly, the guy who used to be an advisor to the Secretary General of NATO a long time ago and ran this thing called the Institute for Statecraft and was involved in the Kerch Bridge plan to blow up the Kerch Bridge. You know, he's military intelligence, and, you know, of course, the term military intelligence is itself an oxymoron. And this is a guy who entertains mad fantasies about who the Russians are and what kind of threat they are, and these are the kind of people who will be suggesting to NATO, we might need to escalate. And these people, you know, this is Dr. Strangelove territory. They would escalate to the point of a nuclear war.
I mean, trying to get inside their heads. It's not a pleasant place to be, but is it? Do you think that they are simply too proud to admit that they've made a mess of all this and that they're going to lose, and so they're kind of doubling down on what is essentially a stupid, failed decision in the first place?
They are doubling down. I mean, what's interesting about this whole period, I think, is that many of the best critiques of NATO strategy in the West are coming from people on the right, ex-military people, ex-intelligence people, McGregor, Scott Ritter, even Jeffrey Sachs, for God's sakes, John Mearsheimer, and these are all people who are not leftists, with a possible small exception for Jeffrey Sachs, but who are on the right and who are criticising liberals and those who are in favour of escalation in Ukraine, and it's an extraordinary position where, on the left and amongst liberals in this country, that most people are in favour of standing with Ukraine, whatever that means. Whereas in America, there's all sorts of right-wingers who are giving a much better account of what's actually going on.
Well, I'm rather pleased to see that at least the UK Stop the War coalition, which I think is John Rees and Lindsay German, the Communist Party of Britain or something, basically, and they've now taken down this demand from the British Stop the War coalition that the Russians withdraw from Ukraine, partly, I suppose, because it's very difficult to actually explain what Ukraine is now. It's very much a disputed word and a disputed border. But anyway, your fighting fund, David.
Yes, okay. So as you mentioned before, I was sacked by the University of Bristol in October 2021, and then I went through an appeal process at the university, which of course was unsuccessful, and I now am shaping up for a battle with the university at an industrial tribunal starting on the 16th of October in Bristol, which will last 2 weeks. And of course I have to raise funds for my legal team for that, which is a little bit expensive. And so I have a fighting fund appeal to ask people to contribute towards my legal costs. And of course what I'm fighting for is that people shouldn't be sacked for having political views on Israel, and indeed that they should be able to have the academic freedom to research and publish on questions of Israel and Zionism and Islamophobia, which the university has clearly not allowed me to do. So I would say that what I'm fighting for is academic freedom, and for the ability of people in the future to advance anti-Zionist ideas and beliefs, and as a result for them not to be sacked. So I would ask for people to support the appeal, which is at fightingfund.org, and you can donate money there in a variety of ways.
Is it electronic or is cash allowed?
Cash is allowed. Yes, very kind. Thank you.
Okay, Martin, this struggle that David's been involved in, academic freedom, is quite a serious form of cancellation. We've seen cancellation in politics in all sorts of areas at the moment, aren't we?
Yeah, I just read an article in the London Review of Books not long ago by Srivanasan, I think it is, about this whole issue of academic freedom. because it's being presented, because we've now got the czar that's been appointed by the government to insist on free speech in universities, which is actually more to do with silencing people they disagree with. So you can see the kind of Orwellian world we now live in, where people who are trying to silence other people complain that they themselves are being silenced, and that they've got to force universities to follow their own rules about freedom of speech. And of course there's a big difference between freedom of speech and academic freedom, which is the article covers, because if you're an academic, you don't just get to say anything. There's all this sort of peer review and all the rest of it. And they're saying, well, there aren't enough climate change deniers in the universities. I said, well, that's because it's all peer reviewed. You know, you're allowed to have a view that you don't like climate change, but you can't be the climate change professor, because you can't, because there's a whole process by which, you know, an academic freedom isn't just the freedom to say anything you want. If you want to, you know, you've got to, it's all got to be properly looked into.
On this, Is this just a kind of side effect of privatisation of universities and the gradual creeping privatisation?
I mean, the privatisation, marketisation of the universities, of course, makes it much more difficult to pursue evidence-based research, especially when that evidence-based research might challenge ideas that powerful institutions don't want challenged. So, and when I say powerful institutions, I mean both the corporations and the states. So, yes, it's difficult. And of course, there's the response to that by the corporations and the state, and the way in which the marketisation enables
these are the people funding many of our universities.
Is that they have increasingly started to fund the university. So there's much more corporate money now funding research, which of course means that the research won't be proper science. And indeed, the intelligence services themselves are funding university departments and grants all over the place. It's extraordinary.
Well, and also whole blocks being built on the side of university buildings being funded by private companies. I don't know if that's anyway. Where's the best place for people to follow you online? Your blog. I know Spinwatch was one place that you can keep an eye on stuff you're up to, David. But Twitter, where are your various socials, please?
On Twitter, I'm tracking_power, and I also edit the website powerbase.info. And the site for donating to the appeal is fightingfund, or one word, .org.
Professor David Miller? Well, actually, no longer professor, am I right? You're a doctor, but no longer a professor because you're not at the university. Is that right?
I think so.
Okay. David Miller, thanks ever so much for joining us.